The Oval Office isn't just an office. It's a symbol of power, a bastion of democracy, and the place where world-changing decisions are made. But behind the oak doors and bulletproof windows, the walls of the White House hold secrets. Secrets so dark and scandalous, they were meant to be buried forever. From secret children and rigged elections to affairs that could have toppled the government, these are all the secret presidential scandals they tried to hide. Spoiler alert, the history you were taught in school is only half the story, and some of these secrets are far more shocking than you can possibly imagine. Let's start at the very beginning, with one of the founding fathers. His face is carved on Mount Rushmore, but behind the image of the unwavering thinker was a truth that historians tried to deny for nearly 200 years. We're talking about Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence, the man who wrote the immortal words, "All men are created equal." Yet in his own home, at his Monticello estate, lived hundreds of people who were not free. And one of them was not just his slave. She was the mother of his children. Her name was Sally Hemings. She was the half-sister of Jefferson's late wife. They shared the same father. Sally came to Jefferson in Paris when she was just 14 years old, and historians believe that's where their relationship began. Over the next few decades, she gave birth to 6 children, all of whom bore a striking resemblance to the third president of the United States. During Jefferson's lifetime, his political enemies spread rumors about this as a dirty smear. Newspapers called Sally Jefferson's African Venus and mocked his hypocrisy. But the establishment and the president's supporters fiercely denied everything. They created a story that one of Jefferson's nephews was the father of the children, desperately trying to protect his legacy. That lie survived for almost 2 centuries. Historians wrote books praising Jefferson and dismissing the rumors as slander. But the descendants of Sally Hemings passed their story down from generation to generation. They knew the truth, and eventually, science proved them right. In 1998, DNA tests conducted on the descendants of the Jefferson family proved with 99% certainty that Thomas Jefferson was the father of at least one, and most likely all, of Sally Hemings' children. The secret that America's elite had kept for 200 years was finally exposed. The man who wrote about freedom had lived a lie, keeping his own family in bondage. But if you think sex scandals are a modern invention, the next president proves otherwise. His scandal was so public and so messy that crowds chanted about it in the streets during his presidential campaign. Grover Cleveland was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, but he was also the only candidate to face a secret love child scandal in the middle of an election. 10 years before he ran for president, Cleveland, then a bachelor, had an affair with a young widow named Maria Halpin. When Halpin gave birth to a son, she named him Oscar Folsom Cleveland and claimed Grover was the father. Cleveland did not shy away from responsibility. Although he claimed he wasn't sure the child was his, he agreed to pay child support. To avoid public shame, he did something shocking by today's standards. He had Maria Halpin forcibly committed to a mental asylum and had their son sent to an orphanage. Years later, when Cleveland was running for president, his political opponents dug up the story. It was an explosion. Newspapers ran wild with the headlines, and at rallies, Republicans chanted, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha ha ha." The scandal could have destroyed any other candidate, but Cleveland did something unexpected. He didn't lie. He instructed his staff, he publicly admitted to caring for the child, though he didn't directly admit paternity. This honesty, strangely, worked in his favor. Voters appreciated his directness, and Democrats responded to the chant with one of their own. "Hurrah for Cleveland and Stevens, the other guy has his too." Cleveland won the election. But the story of Maria Halpin and her son remains a dark stain on his reputation, proof that even so-called honest politicians are capable of ruthless acts to protect their careers. However, not all scandals were about personal lives. Some were about greed, corruption, and a complete betrayal of the public trust. And perhaps no president was entangled in dirtier dealings than Warren G. Harding. Harding was elected in 1921 with the promise of a return to normalcy after World War I. He looked like a president from a movie, handsome and charming. But behind the scenes, his administration was one of the most corrupt in American history. His friends, whom he appointed to high-level positions, were nicknamed the Ohio Gang, and they treated the government like their personal piggy bank. The biggest scandal was Teapot Dome. Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, secretly leased government-owned oil fields at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and in California to private oil companies. In return, Fall received, quote, 9, quote, which were actually bribes, totaling over $400,000, the equivalent of nearly $7 million today. It was a brazen sell-off of national resources. When the truth began to surface, Washington was shaken. The investigation dragged on for years, but eventually, Albert Fall became the first cabinet member in history to go to prison. Harding himself never faced the consequences. During a cross-country trip aimed at restoring his image, he died suddenly of a heart attack. Some even whispered that his own wife had poisoned him to save him from the shame of impeachment. While there's no evidence of this, his sudden death allowed him to escape accountability for the corruption that thrived right under his nose. But Harding's scandals weren't limited to money. His personal life was just as chaotic. He had multiple mistresses, including Nan Britton, who was 30 years his junior. She gave birth to his daughter, whom he never acknowledged, and even had sex with him in a White House closet while Secret Service agents stood guard. Harding literally turned a symbol of American power into a venue for his secret trysts. Protecting a president's image at all costs is not a new phenomenon. But perhaps the biggest deception in presidential history wasn't about sex or money, but about the physical condition of the man who led the nation through the Great Depression and World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, is one of the most revered presidents. He was elected 4 times and radiated strength and confidence at a time when America needed it most. But he was hiding a huge secret. He couldn't walk. In 1921, at the age of 39, Roosevelt contracted polio, which left him paralyzed from the waist down. In an era when physical weakness was seen as a sign of an inability to lead, this could have ended his political career. So FDR and his team orchestrated one of the most successful cover-ups in history. He designed special steel leg braces that allowed him to stand upright, supporting himself with a cane and the arm of one of his sons or an aide. He learned to quote 10 by swiveling his torso and throwing his legs forward. It was excruciatingly painful and required incredible upper body strength. The press was an unspoken accomplice in this deception. There was a gentleman's agreement not to photograph the president in his wheelchair or in a vulnerable position. Secret Service agents would walk ahead of him to clear a path and would block photographers who tried to get the forbidden shot. As a result, in his 12 years as president, only a handful of photographs exist that show his disability. The American people had no idea about the true condition of their leader. They saw him as strong, standing at a podium or waving from a car, never knowing that just out of frame he was being carried or wheeled. This deception was designed to maintain the nation's faith in its leader during the darkest of times. But it was a carefully crafted illusion that hid a painful reality. The next scandal, however, was not an illusion, but a cold, harsh reality that unfolded behind the glittering facade of quote 11 John F. Kennedy. And his wife Jacqueline created an image of youth, glamour, and idealism. Their time in the White House was nicknamed quote 12 quote after King Arthur's mythical kingdom. But behind the curtain, the king was reckless, and his behavior threatened not only his marriage, but national security. JFK's sexual appetite was insatiable and incredibly risky. He had affairs with White House interns, Hollywood starlets, and the wives of his friends. Secret Service agents would smuggle women into the White House, sometimes even when Jackie was in the building. It was an open secret among the Washington elite, but the press of that era would never have dared to report on it. 2 of his affairs, however, were particularly dangerous. The first was with Marilyn Monroe. The legendary movie star was not just a passing fling. Their connection was so intense that Monroe reportedly believed she would become the next First Lady. When Kennedy broke it off, she was devastated and allegedly threatened to call a press conference and reveal everything. Her sudden death from an overdose still fuels conspiracy theories to this day. The second, and even more dangerous, affair was with a woman named Judith Campbell Exner. Exner was not just a beautiful socialite. She was the mistress of not only the President of the United States, but also of Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago mob. Think about that. The President of the United States was sharing a mistress with one of the most powerful and ruthless gangsters in the country. The FBI was wiretapping Giancana and knew about the connection. This was compromising information of incredible power. The mob could have blackmailed the president with it. This wasn't just marital infidelity. it was a colossal national security failure. Kennedy's legacy is still wrapped in the myth of, quote, 13, quote. But the truth is, his personal recklessness put the country at unimaginable risk. This secret was buried for decades, but when it surfaced, it forever changed our perception of the brilliant young president. If Kennedy's recklessness was hidden behind a glamorous facade, the next scandal was about dirty, paranoid politics and brought down a president on live television. We are talking, of course, about Richard Nixon and Watergate. It all started with a minor burglary at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex in 1972. 5 men were caught red-handed trying to plant listening devices. At first, Nixon's White House dismissed it as a, quote, 14 and denied any involvement. But 2 young reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, started digging. With the help of a mysterious source known as __quote_15____, who was revealed decades later to be FBI Associate Director Mark Felt, they began to unravel a web of lies that led directly to the Oval Office. This was no mere burglary. It was a massive campaign of political espionage and sabotage, run by Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President. They wiretapped phones, stole documents, used dirty tricks to discredit opponents, and maintained a secret slush fund to pay for these illegal operations. As the congressional investigation began to close in on the truth, Nixon and his top aides orchestrated a massive cover-up. They lied to the FBI, destroyed evidence, and paid the burglars hush money. Nixon famously declared on television, "I am not a crook." It was a lie. The turning point was the revelation that Nixon had secretly recorded every conversation in the Oval Office. These tapes contain the undeniable proof of his guilt. Nixon fought desperately to keep them private, citing executive privilege, but the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that he had to turn them over. One of the tapes, the so-called smoking gun, recorded Nixon ordering his chief of staff to use the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation into the break-in. It was a direct abuse of power, obstruction of justice. Facing certain impeachment, Richard Nixon did what no president had done before him. On August 9, 1974, he resigned from office. Watergate became the byword for political scandal, a permanent reminder of how the lust for power can corrupt even the most powerful man in the world. But what if a scandal isn't just about covering up a crime, but about waging a secret, illegal war that neither the American people nor even Congress knows about? That's exactly what happened under Ronald Reagan. The Iran-Contra affair is one of the most complex and tangled scandals in U.S. history. In essence, it was 2 secret operations rolled into one. Part 1. The Reagan administration was secretly selling weapons to Iran, a country they publicly called a state sponsor of terrorism. The goal was to secure the release of American hostages being held in Lebanon by pro-Iranian groups. This directly violated America's official policy of never negotiating with terrorists. But that was only half the story. Part 2 was even more illegal. The profits from these arms sales were secretly diverted to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua, known as the Contras. The U.S. Congress had explicitly forbidden funding the Contras by passing the Boland Amendment. So the Reagan administration violated its own stated policy and a direct law passed by Congress. They created a shadow government operating outside the law, with Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the National Security Council at the center of the web. When the story leaked to the press in 1986, it created a political firestorm. Reagan at first denied everything, stating on national television that the accusations had no foundation. But as more evidence emerged, the story began to unravel. In televised congressional hearings, Oliver North became a cult figure, defending his actions as a patriotic duty. He admitted to lying to Congress and shredding documents. The key question became, what did the president know, and when did he know it? Reagan claimed he did not know about the diversion of funds to the Contras. He was portrayed as a detached, perhaps already suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's, leader who was failed by his overzealous subordinates. The official report concluded that Reagan bore responsibility for a lack of oversight, but found no direct evidence that he authorized the illegal scheme. Many Americans still believe Reagan was either lying or criminally incompetent. Iran-Contra permanently stained his presidency, showing how far the executive branch can go when it believes it is operating above the law. Finally, we come to a scandal that didn't involve war or espionage, but captivated the entire world and led to the impeachment of the second president in U.S. history. It was the story of lying under oath over a sexual relationship with a 22-year-old White House intern. The scandal involving Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky began not in the Oval Office, but in a courtroom for a completely different case. A former Arkansas State employee named Paula Jones was suing Clinton for sexual harassment. During his sworn deposition for that case, Jones's lawyers asked Clinton if he'd had a sexual relationship with a young intern named Monica Lewinsky. Clinton looked them in the eye and said no. Lewinsky, in turn, also signed an affidavit denying the affair. But there was one problem. Lewinsky had confided in her friend and coworker, Linda Tripp, about her affair with the president, and Tripp had been secretly recording their conversations. Those tapes were a ticking time bomb. When special counsel Kenneth Starr, who was initially investigating the Clintons' financial dealings, learned of the tape's existence, his investigation took a sharp turn. It was no longer about land deals or money. It was about perjury and obstruction of justice. Faced with the evidence, Clinton went before the American people and delivered one of the most infamous lines in political history. He wagged his finger at the camera and stated forcefully, "I want to say one thing to the American people. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." It was a blatant lie. Later, when the existence of a blue dress owned by Lewinsky containing a stain of Clinton's semen became public, denial was impossible. DNA doesn't lie. In August 1998, Clinton was forced to testify before a grand jury and finally admit that he'd had an _25_, his previous lie under oath. And this public denial became the basis for his impeachment. The House of Representatives voted to impeach Clinton on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. Although the Senate ultimately acquitted him and he remained in office, the scandal forever changed his legacy. It was a story of personal indiscretion that spiraled into a national crisis, paralyzing the government for months and leaving deep scars on the body of American politics. From the Founding Fathers to modern leaders, the history of the presidency is not just a story of triumphs, but also a story of human weakness, greed, and deception. These scandals aren't just salacious gossip. They reveal how the abuse of power can threaten the very foundations of democracy. They remind us that the people who hold the highest office in the land are not always the saints they are portrayed as in history books. They are human, with all their flaws and vices, and the biggest secrets they try to hide often say more about them than any public speech ever could.